Hello and welcome. You are listening to Pint Size Therapy, where we explore all things related to mental health healing, personal growth and development, emotional wellness, and the human experience in pint-sized bites. I am your host, Dr. Aletha Clark, a licensed psychotherapist, certified hypnotherapist, and master addiction counselor, and I am happy to have you here with me today as you embark on your mental wellness journey. While I appreciate you tuning in, don't forget this podcast is informational only and is not a substitute for seeking out your own mental health counseling with a licensed professional. So join me as we jump into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. Today we're going to be talking about something deeply personal, painfully real, and psychologically devastating. Over the past few months, we have witnessed a disturbing surge in mass deportation raids. They've been swift, traumatic removals of immigrant parents, siblings, and neighborhoods, peoples from their homes, schools, workplaces, and communities. These events are often carried out with little warning, significant force, and many times by armed agents in tactical gear. These operations aren't just breaking up families, they're breaking individual psyches. It's not enough to discuss these events in terms of legality or political strategy. We must confront what is happening through a human lens, a psychological lens, and examine the deeply rooted emotional and mental health impacts that such acts have on children, parents, communities, and even those of us witnessing it from the outside. This isn't just a policy issue. This is a human issue. Behind every flashing badge, knocking at the door, there's a child, there's a family, there's a community, there's a future hanging in the balance. Today, we're going to explore the emotional and psychological toll of these raids, from the trauma of forced separation to the ripple effects that linger long after the agents leave. This conversation matters. For mental health professionals, it's a call to trauma-informed care and our responsibility for social justice. For advocates and allies, it's a call to action. For our impacted families, it's an acknowledgement of a pain that is too often made invisible. And for the general public, it's a mirror. It's a reflection of who we are becoming and what we may be losing in the process. So I invite you to stay present with me today, even if it's uncomfortable, especially if it's uncomfortable. The moment an ICE raid occurs, the psychological earthquake begins. For many families, the fear doesn't start on the day of the raid. It lives with them daily, like a shadow, like a sense of being hunted and targeted like prey. The knock at the door, the sound of the helicopters, the unexpected visitor, the police or unmarked cars driving in your neighborhood. These are all perceived as potential threats. Psychological distress manifests in high levels of chronic anxiety. Caregivers live in a constant state of survival mode, carefully planning their routes, avoiding public offices, preparing their children for emergency plans, and sometimes altogether refusing to leave their homes. This anticipatory trauma erodes emotional health long before any official action actually occurs. Children are especially vulnerable. Their brains and bodies are still developing, and their security is intricately tied to routine and attachment. So this abrupt removal of a caregiver, it results in things such as separation anxiety, nightmares, decline in academic performance and attendance, ultimately attachment trauma. The financial strain is immediate and intense. Many families rely on both parents to survive. Deportation removes not only emotional anchors, but also economic stability. It forces families into poverty, housing insecurity, and even work conditions that exploit them. In some cases, Older children are pulled from school to help with income, sacrificing education and childhood. But this is not individual trauma. What we're experiencing, it's collective trauma. It reverberates through neighborhoods, churches, and schools. It creates a communal sense of fear, distrust, and destabilization. Communities notice a drop in participation or people being out and about. Schools notice an increase in absenteeism. And health providers, they witness rising mental health symptoms with limited resources. We must also acknowledge the impact that these raids have on the people who are directly targeted, whether they are undocumented immigrants or legal residents caught in the chaos. The emotional and psychological toll on these adults is profound. Even if not physically removed, being subject to such aggressive enforcement tactics can result in long-lasting psychological damage. They become very constantly fearful of what's going on around them, of public spaces, becoming increasingly depressed and hopeless. Repeated exposure to systemic violence fosters a sense of despair. Many adults report feeling powerless or isolated. The public and forceful nature of raids often results in deep personal shame, especially when communities see their children witnessing this. The daily stress of navigating uncertainty, being locked up and being uncertain about your legal status, your potential loss of employment, worry for your family's safety. Even individuals who are permanent residents, naturalized citizens, or U.S. born may be mistakenly profiled or targeted, contributing to collective anxiety within entire communities of color. These adults often feel invisible, criminalized, and abandoned by systems that were actually meant to protect them. When families are fractured suddenly, without warning or dignity, the result is complex trauma with devastatingly long-lasting impacts. So let's talk about brain science for a minute. When armed, masked agents storm a home, a business, a public space, a community, the human brain responds as if under direct physical threat, because it is. Agents often arrive unannounced for the purpose of surprise or catching people off guard, with bulletproof vests, weapons drawn, extreme force, like they're going into war. For those suddenly experiencing this, there is absolutely no context. It's only chaos. This sudden, terrifying intrusion, it activates our amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting danger. It sends out an emergency signal to the entire body, prompting a cascade of physiological changes. Our heart rate increases, our breathing becomes shallow, blood flows away from the brain and towards the muscles with intent to respond and react. But our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that is our logic center, responsible for reasoning and decision making, it completely goes offline. The body goes into survival mode, the classic fight, flight, or freeze response. Some individuals may try to run, others may resist, many will fight for their life, some freeze in terror. These are not calculated acts of defiance. These are all trauma responses, not conscious decisions. In psychological terms, being forcibly removed from one's home in front of loved ones, often by masked agents, bears the emotional and neurological signature of a kidnapping. There's no space for explanation or closure, only helplessness and fear. For children witnessing this, it can cause the same neurodevelopmental impacts as domestic violence or sexual assault. And that imprint, it stays in the nervous system long after the moment is over. And what about the agents involved? Many detach emotionally. They rely on the rules and authority to justify their actions. This desensitization process, it's a form of psychological distancing, that mirrors what we see in other institutions of systemic harm. When a person is taken, the trauma doesn't end, it just continues to evolve. Families left behind struggle with ongoing symptoms of PTSD, flashbacks of the event, avoidance, hypervigilance, trouble sleeping. Children may internalize the belief that the world is unsafe and it's unpredictable. Their sense of identity and belonging becomes fractured. Their trust in authority figures, including police and teachers and counselors, it erodes. Even very young children absorb the anxiety around them, showing distress in their own age-appropriate ways. But many individuals experience ambiguous loss. It's a loss or it's a grief that has no closure, where the person is physically gone but psychologically present. It is compounded by legal uncertainty, deportation delays, and limited communication. People might not know how to grieve because they don't know if the goodbye is forever. And this grief, it becomes generational. Children of deported parents often carry the psychological burdens into adulthood. They may develop high-functioning anxiety, perfectionism, fear of failure, or a deep mistrust. The long-term result is often disconnection, feeling disconnected from self, from others, and from a sense of safety in the world. Perhaps one of the most insidious impacts of deportation raids is the loss of dignity, not just externally, but internally. When a person or group is constantly labeled as illegal, a threat, or less than, they begin to internalize these messages. This is the psychology of dehumanization. It's the process by which society strips a person of their human identity and replaces it with an objectified, criminalized version. It's how people are able to disconnect themselves from the person directly being impacted by this. Over time, many individuals who are feeling this dehumanization, they start to question their sense of worth. They feel ashamed for needing help or blame themselves for the trauma. They withdraw from society. Many begin to believe they deserve this treatment. They internalize messages like, I shouldn't have come here, or maybe this is my punishment. And the people who contribute to this dehumanization also then begin to blame them. They begin to, make them feel like, no, you don't belong here. Yes, you should be punished. In environments of repeated and unpredictable threats, like the ongoing fear of deportation, people may begin to experience learned helplessness. This occurs when individuals feel that no matter what actions they take, they cannot change or escape their circumstances. Over time, this perceived lack of control leads to apathy, resignation, and a diminished ability to advocate for themselves. Individuals may stop seeking support. They may refrain from calling attention to injustices or withdraw from community life altogether. This psychological response becomes a survival strategy, but one that reinforces isolation and diminishes resilience. The belief that no matter what they do, they will be punished or harmed. It is a psychological death knell for hope and healing. And it's deeply corrosive, not just to individuals, but to the very fabric of community resilience. Meanwhile, the rest of society becomes numb. Our compassion fades, our fear is weaponized, and we begin to see people as problems to solve, not human beings in a crisis. One of the most common defenses and justifications of these actions rest on a single sharp blade: legality. They broke the law. They came here illegally. They knew the risk. But legality and morality are not the same. Slavery was once legal. The forced removal of indigenous children from their homes was once legal. Mass incarceration of Black men has often followed legal channels. The internment of Japanese Americans was once legal. The denial of civil rights to Black Americans was once legal. History shows us that legality has often been used to hold up oppression, not justice. When legal systems become untethered from compassion, dignity, and equity, they become tools of harm. History is full of morally bankrupt actions that have been upheld by the law. We must ask, what kind of nation are we becoming if legality justifies cruelty? Are we enforcing laws in a way that protects human rights or erodes them? The overemphasis on legality erases the complex moral realities of migration, the desperation of families fleeing violence, the historical policies that created instability in their home countries that were no longer safe, the economic systems that benefit from undocumented labor. Imagine what it took for individuals and families to flee their countries, to leave everything behind, to move to places that they might not have known the language. They might not have had any type of support or community. By reducing people to status, legal or illegal, we deny the full humanity and history behind their presence. We don't understand and look into the context of why they were here. And we legitimize cruelty. These aren't just legal matters, they're moral ones. Human rights are not conditional. They're not conditional on citizenship. Dignity doesn't stop at a border. What we are witnessing today is not new. It echoes through time. The mass separation of Black families during slavery, forced boarding schools for indigenous children, deportations of Jewish families during World War II, internment camps of Japanese Americans during the 1940s. Each of these historical injustices relied on similar strategies that we are seeing play out today in real time. It starts with labeling a group as inferior or dangerous, normalizing surveillance and control, using legality to excuse cruelty, justifying the separation for the greater good. Psychologically, these patterns teach the public to accept the suffering of others as necessary, even righteous. It fosters complicity. It numbs us to the cries of the vulnerable. Recognizing these echoes is not about hyperbole. It is about accountability. History offers warnings, and right now, it is a warning to us again. For communities facing these raids, the trauma isn't new, it's generational. Latinx, Black, and Indigenous communities have long histories of forced separation, surveillance, and systemic oppression. What's happening now reactivates those ancestral wounds. This concept of generational trauma, the psychological wounds of one generation being passed down to the next, even in the absence of original traumatic events. Trauma can be transmitted through behavior modeling, emotional absence, overprotection, silence, or even inherited stress. Children of trauma survivors may grow up with hyper-awareness, emotional repression, and a deep, unspoken fear of instability or abandonment. These patterns, if undressed, can affect relationships, parenting, and self-worth for years to come. But despite this weight, many families and communities exhibit remarkable cultural resilience. Cultural resilience is the ability of a group to draw on its shared values, traditions, identity, and collective strength to navigate adversity, to recover, to rise. In immigrant communities, this resilience shows up in powerful ways, in maintaining language and storytelling to preserve cultural identity, sharing art, music, forming mutual aid networks, underground safety plans, gathering for shared rituals of resistance, of healing, of grounding. Cultural resilience does not erase trauma, but it provides a buffer. It creates a foundation for post-traumatic growth, a reminder of inherited wisdom, a form of resistance that say, we may be targeted, but we are not broken. Cultural rituals and cultural identity, when honored and supported, can be a source of tremendous healing. The long-term result of both trauma and resilience is often disconnection, but also reconstruction. Healing is possible, especially when communities are supported in culturally competent, safe, and inclusive ways. But we must also give people access to this trauma-informed care. We must support communities and spaces where their stories are heard and not judged. We cannot ignore the toll that this actually takes on those of us who are also bearing witness to this: the therapists, the teachers, the social workers, the neighbors, the loved ones, the advocates, even strangers watching it on social media. Vicarious trauma is real. It arises when we are exposed directly or indirectly to the trauma of others. We carry this vicarious trauma, this heaviness that comes from seeing others suffer and feeling powerless to stop it. In highly affected communities, even those not directly targeted, they live in a state of anticipatory grief. They fear their neighbor's door will be next, that fear compounded in a community-wide mental health crisis. We must acknowledge this. We must provide safe spaces for processing and healing for everyone involved. Because when we fail to name the trauma, we leave it to fester. But becoming numb is not the answer. We must hold each other accountable and hold space for one another's pain. There is perhaps no greater psychological danger than the loss of collective empathy. When we begin to see people as problems, as burdens, or as threats, we allow cruelty to flourish. Dehumanization isn't just a political stance, it's a psychological condition, and it spreads. We are witnessing a growing moral injury among people who are asked to participate or ignore this harm, and a growing emotional detachment among the public. People become desensitized to human suffering when it is repeated and normalized, especially when the targets are othered or criminalized. The result is an erosion of our communal conscience. One of the most disturbing examples of this detachment is the spectacle-like documentation of suffering. Recently, people have been taking and sharing photos in front of signs, like the one displayed at an immigration detention center reading Alligator Alcatraz, mimicking a tourist attraction almost. This is not a trivial or isolated behavior. It actually is historically rooted. It echoes the way white families once packed picnics and posed for photographs at public lynchings, treating brutal acts of racial violence as community events rather than human tragedies. These acts of normalization and even celebration of cruelty are red flags. They're signs that a society is slipping into moral decay. Psychologically, this speaks to a dangerous form of disassociation. People mentally disconnecting from the suffering in order to maintain their own comfort or to justify the system. It becomes easier to tolerate cruelty when we reduce people to labels or caricatures. This detachment feeds dehumanization and legitimizes policies that would otherwise be considered unacceptable. If we lose our capacity to care, to advocate, to be moved by suffering, we risk losing something essential to our humanity. And once it's gone, it's very hard to get back. Restoring that empathy begins with recognizing these signs of detachment, naming them, and refusing to look away. It begins with reminding ourselves that behind every headline, every raid, every border wall, there are human beings. These are families and futures at stake. What we're witnessing is a human rights crisis, a psychological emergency, and we can't afford to look away. So what do? We need to start by rehumanizing the conversation. We need to speak up. We need to bear witness. We need to challenge the narratives that reduce people to their status or their mistakes. We push for trauma-informed policies that prioritize safety and mental health. So here's what I invite you to do. I'd like you to educate yourself and others on the long-lasting psychological and traumatic impact of deportation. I want you to advocate for trauma-informed policies and humane reform. Be an ally. Fight for those who cannot fight for themselves and those who feel like they're in this fight alone. For those directly impacted, please seek out support in faith and cultural groups, in culturally competent mental health services, and in community that can hold space for healing and resilience. And finally, we need to check in. We need to check in with ourselves, with our families, with our communities. We make sure we have the emotional capacity to stay in the fight and the spiritual nourishment to hold compassion. And above all, we refuse to become numb. Let us not lose our empathy. Let us not lose our humanity and dehumanize others. Let us not lose each other. I really want to thank you today for listening, for staying grounded, for staying open, staying compassionate. And I implore you, continue to stay empathetic and continue to fight. As always, thank you for joining me today on Pint-Sized Therapy. If you found this conversation meaningful, I invite you to leave me a comment, like, subscribe, and share with your family and friends. Come visit my website at pintsizedtherapy.com and my Etsy shop at pintsizedtherapy.etsy.com, where you will find resources to accompany our various discussions and encourage you to continue your wellness journey. Once again, I am Dr. Aletha Clark. Until next time, remember to protect your peace and take care of your mental health.